This panel discussion about climate change. I want to thank the Harvard Kennedy School, and this is the program in environmental and natural resources. Is that right? Did I get that right? So thank you for coming. Thank you to Tomas for organizing this and all the other people. So we're here tonight to talk about climate change, which is obviously an issue on everyone's mind with the recent release this week of the IPCC synthesis report, with all the activities here on campus related to divestment, with the recent climate change march in New York City. So many things that have brought our attention to this question of climate. And today we have the honor and privilege of having three people who are really working at the front line of climate change activism, climate change policy, climate change solutions, which I think is really great and important for us to do, because I came to this issue from the perspective of climate science, and so much of the discussion that I've been party to has been about the science. But I really think we're at a kind of crucial moment now where we know the science. As Arnold Schwarzenegger said 10 years ago, we know the science, we see the threat, we know the time for action is now. That was a decade ago. And I think the rest of the world has kind of caught up with Arnold. And I think we all realize that now. So it's great that the IPCC has issued its new report. I was thinking about how to tweet it, and I just thought this morning, I think I have to tweet same science, more worried tone of voice or something like that, because that's really what this report amounts to. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel, but before I do, I just want to make two announcements on behalf of other groups who have interesting activities coming up. So on November 19th, there's going to be a film screening here at the Kennedy School, one flight down, from 6 to 8 p.m., a new film called Extreme Realities about climate change, extreme weather events, and national security. If you're interested in that, Amanda over here can give you more information. In addition, I've been asked to announce another interesting event, Restoring Ecosystems to Reverse Global Warming, a project at Tufts University, a Boston area conference, November 21st to 23rd. So if you're interested in that, Adam over there can give you more information about that. So lots of good things going on for anyone who's interested and wants to be more involved. So today I have the honor of introducing our three speakers. I'm going to sit down at this point, and I'll introduce them one by one as they speak, because I don't know about you, but I won't remember it right they're all first. So our first speaker is Jamie Henn. Jamie Henn. The worst possible thing is get your speakers' names wrong. Actually, people mispronounce my name all the time. Jamie is a co-founder and strategy and communications director of 350.org, which I think almost everybody here knows, a major international climate campaign and activist organization. He coordinated communications efforts for the recent People's Climate March, which again I think everyone knows was amazingly successful. Over 400,000 people came to the streets of New York City, including many of us here in this room, and a big contingent of students from the Divest Harvard group, which was great to see. He's helped lead 350's fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, their work supporting the growing fossil fuel divestment campaign, and their past international days of climate action around the world. They've helped organize more than 20,000 demonstrations in over 182 countries. So I think that helps to show how global this movement really has become, and how all over the world people recognize the significance and importance of this issue. He's a graduate of Middlebury College in Vermont, and he's co-author of a book called Fight Global Warming Now. So, Jamie, welcome.
Great. Thank you. I think we're actually going to kick things off with a short video, so I'll let Tomas run the show.
Dear Matafele, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an egg and bald as the Buddha. Your thighs that are thunder, shrieks that are lightning, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks along the lagoon. Dear Matafele, I want to tell you about that lagoon, that lucid, sleepy lagoon lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day, that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of your seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander rootless, with only a passport to call home. Dear Matafele, Don't cry. Mommy promises you, no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas. No backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals. No blindfolded bureaucracies gonna push this mother ocean over the edge. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's gonna become a climate change refugee. Or should I say, no one else. To the Carteret Islanders of Papua New Guinea and to the Taro Islanders of Fiji, I take this moment to apologize to you. We are drawing the line here. Because baby, we are going to fight. Your mommy, daddy, Boo, Dimma, your country, and your president too, we will all fight. And even though there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist, that the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, and Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and floods of Pakistan, Algeria, and Colombia, and hurricanes, tidal waves, and earthquakes didn't exist, still, there are those who see us. Hands reaching out, fists raising up, banners unfurling, megaphones booming, and we are canoes blocking coal ships. We are the radiance of solar villages. We are the rich, clean soil of the farmer's past. We are petitions blooming from teenage fingertips. We are families biking, recycling, reusing, engineers dreaming, designing, building, artists painting, dancing, writing. We are spreading the word. And there are thousands out on the street, marching with signs, hand in hand, chanting for change now. They're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us. Because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. Dear Montefilipino, you were eyes heavy with drowsy weight. So just close those eyes, baby, and sleep in peace. Because we won't let you down. You'll see.
To represent civil society at the Climate Summit. So that's called, I think we just put her name in, Kathy Jetnil, Jetnil, Climate Summit at Marshall Islands. She's in the Marshall Islands.
Thank you.
We'll talk a little bit more about that.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think still watching that film, I think gives me goosebumps and hearing the powerful words. And that's, in a way, how I feel about the march and all that we're talking about as well. It's been just over a month now since the march took place in New York, and now that I've gotten a little bit more sleep, we're all looking a little bit fresher than we did in the midst of all of that. Trying to kind of think about what lessons can we pull from it. What did the march signify? Where are we going from here? And how does the work that's happening in the streets connect to the work that's happening in negotiating halls, whether those are here at the Harvard campus, in Congress, or at the UN. But first off, just to say thank you to Naomi and to Tomas for pulling this together, and to the Kenny School, and of course to 350 Massachusetts and the Better Futures Project, and Mothers Out Front, and Best Harvard, and all the many groups who are in the house tonight. I was born and raised in Cambridge, so I am proud to be back on my home turf a little bit, and as always have a special spot in my heart for the work that's happening in Massachusetts. I always like to think that we're kind of leading the way. And someone that went out to California for years. People in California are pretty, confident about their leadership on green issues. So it's good to be back on the East Coast a little bit, where I think we're beginning to stir things up as well. So about that march, it was the privilege of a lifetime to get to work on it with thousands of people and local organizers and people kind of working on the core team there in New York. The march was only possible because it was a new sort of collaboration. There were over 1,500 partner organizations that took part of the march, and in a very deep way. Everything from local groups, local chapters of 350 to the Sierra Club to NRDC, but especially exciting, I think, groups that had been, in a way, working on climate change for a long time, but maybe hadn't thought of it like that. They were working on local pollution issues, asthma in the South Bronx, helping prepare their communities for extreme weather events, working on labor issues, and came together in the march to find common cause in a way that I think we've talked about, but maybe we haven't seen in action previously. And I think that was a big area of hope for me. That coalition going forward, I think, is the type that can not only put people in the streets at scale of large movements, but can begin to make itself heard electorally, whether that is at the local level, the national level, and beyond. It's also the type of coalition that I think will challenge us and challenge policymakers or future policymakers here in the room to think about climate change not just as an environmental issue and a scientific issue, but as a social justice issue, as an economic justice issue, as a jobs issue. We need more creative policy out there that is figuring out ways that we can put forward joint solutions to the many different problems that we face. We have probably too many problems on the agenda to be taking them on one by one right now. Looking at these as interconnected as they are and understanding those joint solutions will be really critical. A little bit about the behind the scenes of the march. It was an incredible day, and it was very exciting. We did, in the end, get quite a bit of media, but of course it always is hard to kind of convince people to come out. And one of the things that I think we want to keep working on is figuring out how can we get the mainstream media to do a better job of covering these issues and getting engaged. We were on the phone nearly every day before the march yelling at CNN to try and convince them to send out an additional camera crew, and even late into the night on Sunday, going back and forth with editors of the New York Times about whether or not they'd cite our crowd estimate numbers or if they'd leave it out and if they could trust the activists and things like that. Thankfully, we convinced them. The best media hit for me, speaking as the comms person, was actually not, it's really nice getting the front page of the New York Times and all of that. But the best one for me was watching a show called The View. Does anybody watch The View? Any View fans?
Don't watch it, but I know what it is.
You know The View. The View is like a classic daytime TV show now, with like Whoopi and like other people, like it's mostly women talking about issues, different ones. They're not very political usually. It's like, what's going on, this and that. They did this segment on the march and on climate change, which blew my mind. It was like Naomi Klein walked into like daytime TV. They were talking about it. They were like, the media isn't doing a good job of covering this. That's because they're corporate controlled and we need to get out there and make our voices heard and tackle the climate crisis. And I'm watching this being like, oh my God, what's happened here? That in a way was what the march was all about, which was showing scale and moving this discussion into the mainstream. As campaigners, we always are looking for strategic actions and ways to put policy and fighting pipelines and things like that. We also need to think about how can we operate at scale and how can we begin to get the rest of society on board. The march was a big piece of that, and I think that it began to break through in a way that we haven't before, and that opens up the space for a lot of new possibilities. That said, the heart and soul of this movement is in a lot of those local issues and those fights on the ground. And I actually think that we're stronger because of the diversity of things that we're working on, and not weaker. People often say, well, isn't Keystone a distraction from coal plants, or isn't fracking confusing people about clean energy, or whatever it is. I think that actually what is amazing about the movement that's coming together and how this issue is playing out in this country is how people are finding ways to pick up a piece of it and figure out what they can do at the local level, but connect that up to the broader level as well. We get energy from every single one of those fights, and we get even more energy when we connect with others and we connect the dots between the two. One area where I think we can be stronger, a place where 350 is excited about, is on the solutions piece of it. I think that we have been kind of waiting in a way for our political leaders to put forward a solution. We're sort of saying, if we just make enough noise, then hopefully a member of Congress will step up and say, here's a great bill, this is how we're going to solve it. I think we've waited long enough. We're getting a little sick of waiting. I think it's actually up to all of us to think through what can we put forward that helps frame the issue in a different way, that helps build excitement, whether it's around 100% renewable energy or banning new fossil fuel infrastructure or feed-in tariffs, the work the Citizens Climate Lobby is doing on carbon pricing. Experimenting like that and getting in and helping decide how the economy is going to look in the 21st century is a real area where we can lean into. In terms of the impacts of the march and what energy we can pull from it, I was talking to someone during the march and we were sort of saying, organizing a march is like throwing this big rock into a pond. it makes this huge splash, and it's really exciting, but the thing that really sort of matters is the ripples that go out from that. We did really well on the splash front. I mean, 400,000 people is a big splash, and it was really exciting to see the Secretary General of the UN take part in a major way, to see Obama get up the next day and said, our citizens keep marching, we must heed their call. But, splashes are nice, it's the ripples that really matter. I think we're rippling out in a couple interesting places. One is more mass mobilization. We're able now to move at a scale that kind of puts us into the scale of previous social movements that have done some really amazing change in this country. So I think it's up to us to figure out what's next. Is it back to New York? Is it distributed actions? Should we go to DC? Is it around the UN climate talks in Paris? I'll be honest, we're not exactly sure. There's no secret plan at 350, but the secret plan, if there was one, would be to really have those conversations over the coming months. And so we're deeply talking with labor allies and others about where we can go, but those conversations, most importantly, bubble up from where all of you and where the many people around the world really want to take this movement, so we're excited to do more of that going forward. Second is continuing to play defense. There's a lot of bad stuff coming down the pipeline, and after this evening's election, there might be even more that we're going to be having to face. Knowing that stopping climate change requires keeping more fossil fuels in the ground, we have real work to do when it comes to fracking and the new information coming out about methane leakage rates, when it comes to tar sands and unconventional fossil fuels, and when it comes to the tried and true old fossil fuels like coal. There's more work to be done, and it's important work to stop those projects from happening. I think we also want to make sure that we play offense, though, as well. Divestment has been an amazing way to really start to take on the systematic power of the fossil fuel industry and go after their social license to operate. And there could not be a more important place for that to be taking place than here in Harvard and Massachusetts as well. And so those fights, I think, will be critical and really do help move us forward. And then solutions, as I was saying, I think there's huge potential to keep offering those up and do more to push forward on that. And then finally, the global aspect that I think we'll talk about more. There's real potential, I think, and as the video showed, we have incredible allies all around the world who are fighting this fight and want to join with people here in the US to really take on climate change globally. They don't call it global warming for nothing, of course. So building that global movement to respond to the crisis will be key. So just in closing, I'm feeling pretty hopeful, actually. The science is grim. It's tough reading those IPCC reports, and they, even as they get more louder, the warnings. But looking out at what happened in New York, looking at what's happening here in Massachusetts, looking at what our allies are doing all around the world, I think you can't do anything but be hopeful for the type of movement that's finally coming together.
Wow, that is perfect. Holy smokes. You are a communications expert. Our next speaker is Brendan Guy. Brendan is a global fellow at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he works on global climate change and sustainable policy development. He works to bring together multiple stakeholders to catalyze cross-sector partnerships for collective impact and solutions. He has a master's degree in environmental management from Yale, that other school down the road, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of British Columbia. So welcome.
Great. Thank you, Professor Oreskes, for that introduction, and many thanks to all of you for being here, and also thanks in particular to Tomas, wherever he went, there he is, for organizing this panel and being with us here tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of climate negotiations, which can sometimes be a bit of a black and impenetrable box. So I'm going to try and make it relatively easy to access. I'll stay away from acronyms, but please shoot your hand up if I'm talking gobbledygook. So just quickly to start out with, NRDC, my organization, has been working in the climate space for about the last 25 years or so, even before the UNFCCC and the climate negotiations were formed. Sorry, I used an acronym. Before the climate negotiations started in 1992. And the one thing, the one learning, and this is in the title of this talk, the one learning that we've really taken away from our last 25 years of work is that in order to be successful and effective, is that you have to work at many levels. You have to work at international levels, national levels, regional levels, and local levels. And it's the interaction and the synergy and the finding opportunities for all those different levels aligned where we can make real progress and affect real change. So just to point that just to point that out, here's a nice multi-level building here. So this, obviously you can imagine overlaying with international, national, regional, and local levels here, but you also have all these different facets of society, and I think they were really on display in the climate march. You had the different blocks stacking up along Central Park West, going up in many of these different realms, and probably even more that are around here. But this is just kind of the example of that it's a whole of society approach. People talk about a whole government approach, but it's really a whole of society approach that we need to address climate change. And so that's kind of the frame that I want people to take from this presentation. So in terms of the negotiations, I don't want to get too much into the details, as I said, but the current contours of where the negotiations are going largely come out of the infamous Copenhagen negotiations in 2009 that were largely perceived as a failure. But from this collapse of these negotiations, the international community really came to an understanding that climate action can't be forced down and assigned in a really top-down way, but it's much more of a kind of domestic-oriented and bottom-up approach with some essential top-down elements still to make sure that there's coordination and accountability. So Copenhagen was actually interesting in a couple ways. Developing countries for the first time ever made commitments to reduce their emissions in an international forum, and those commitments were formalized into the Cancun agreements a year later. And then the following year after that, in South Africa, countries agreed to the current sort of negotiating thrust, which is called the Durban Platform. So that's what is happening right now in two streams. One is looking at creating an agreement in 2015 that will set targets for countries after 2020. And then the second strain of this agreement is what's going to happen before 2020. So we know from the IPCC that we need to take action urgently, not just after 2020. So the second stream is really how do you catalyze all those actions in the near term over the next 6 years or so. So here's just a really quick dichotomy that kind of paints the negotiating lay of the land for what's going on over the next year and a bit. And it really reflects this new, I would call it a hybrid architecture in international climate change. So it's hybrid with some top-down elements, but also some bottom-up elements. And it's, again, the real interaction of those multiple levels that people are striving for here. So in terms of the first work stream, countries are going to be coming out with their targets for the emissions reductions that they're seeking by March, or hopefully, of next year. And those are going to be certainly in need of some review and some ratcheting up in terms of their ambition. But the character of these contributions is really determined based on kind of the national, domestic context and where economies are going and what they think they can commit to. But obviously that's probably going to be a little bit of a low ball. So we're hoping that there can be some real strong ratcheting mechanisms, and this is where I'll get back to a little bit later in the presentation about how civil society can really step in. In terms of some of the dynamics in the big players in these negotiations, the US is obviously the real elephant in the room, or one of the biggest players in the room. They are actually taking a number of actions as well as they can within a relatively constrained domestic environment. So we've seen a number of significant actions proposed. So for example, the carbon pollution standards to regulate existing power plants that President Obama proposed earlier this year and will be finalized next year through the EPA. Also a number of vehicle, fuel efficiency, and clean energy initiatives that are being advanced to the President. But there's also a number of international actions, and we really saw these at the UN Climate Summit around climate-proofing foreign aid and diplomacy, around providing better climate data to other countries to help their decision-making, deforestation efforts, climate-smart agriculture, and a number of other items going on down the list. So in terms of the political feasibility of an agreement, the negotiators in the international circles are very well aware of some of the constraints that the US faces in terms of actually ratifying any agreement that would come out in Paris. So we'll see what happens today with Congress, but there's definitely some recognition that it needs to have a more flexible form so that there's some legal aspect to it, there's some ratification, hopefully that can happen, but even if that doesn't happen and it's not ratified, there's other political elements that are worked into the agreement so that the U.S. really can move forward in a meaningful way. To move on to the other big country in the room is China, and we've actually seen really encouraging signs about their appetite for action lately. So at the climate summit, the Chinese announced for the first time ever plans to peak their emissions. They haven't set any dates yet, but they're thinking about this internally very closely. And it could be part of their next 5-year plan to peak their emissions and to cap their consumption of coal. They're doing a number of other actions in terms of piloting regional cap and trade programs with the potential to scale it up to the national level, depending on how it goes. But what's really crucial in China is that air pollution is hitting, especially Beijing, economically and in the pocketbook, and it's hitting the nation's elite. I've heard of some of the business leaders in the country sending their children to go to schools in other countries just because air pollution and the health impacts are so bad. So that is really causing the narrative and the conversation to shift in China. But the other potentially even more transformative changes that are afoot are the environmental mobilizations and the protests that are happening at a local level, not at a broader level, but at a local level. And there's actually 40,000, believe it or not, 40,000 environmental protests per year in China, mostly around local water contamination and toxic issues, but also definitely linked to air pollution as well. And so in this vein, the central government has actually recently been calling for an ecological civilization and to actually reorient to some of the more traditional Confucian values in the country and have them take a more sustainable approach to how they're developing. So there's some really interesting shifts that are taking place in the domestic context of both of these two countries. And I think there's also a recognition, there's an Asia-Pacific APEC, Economic Cooperation meeting next week between the US and China and some of the other players. And the US and China really see climate and energy as a place where they can really advance some of their common interests. And there's a lot of other areas where there's more contention, but climate and energy, they've actually been able to have pretty constructive progress. Just in terms of the other work stream over here on the other side, so we heard loud and clear from the IPCC that we need to take urgent action now, and we can't just wait until 2025 or 2030 or whenever these targets are going to be to really start scaling things up. So this basket on the right-hand side is really to try and grow that groundswell of actions from all different sectors of society, also through national policies though, but to really recognize the role of cities in taking action on climate change, the role of states and regions and some national organizations, and even the role of companies in some cases leading the charge on taking action on climate change. So this is a much more non-globally negotiated, it's less contentious, it's more of a safe space for people to kind of put out innovative and creative ideas in terms of how we can really move the ball down the field in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I wanted to show this picture, just people often talk about how interconnected we are, but it really is interconnected at many, many, many different levels. And you know, it's not just nations are connected to each other or citizens are connected to each other, it's also that cities across the world are connected to each other and they're coordinating their actions and benchmarking the commitments that they're making and holding each other accountable and really forming these interesting and dense networks to actually take action on climate change and to scale their efforts and have some sense of that global, more cumulative impact. So there's some really interesting things that are happening, and the French government, who is going to be the host of the climate conference next year in Paris in 2015, are really very much embracing this strategy and saying that we know that the governmental commitments aren't going to be enough to get us to where we really need to go. So we are going to provide the space and a platform for what they're calling a positive agenda, or agenda positive, en français, to mobilize commitments, solutions, actions from governments at all levels, from businesses, from civil society, from the whole range of different actors to really say that it is all hands on deck to take action on climate change. So there's some interesting shifts taking place there as well. The president of Peru, where the next negotiation is taking place, is called for the greatest alliance that the world has ever seen to take action on climate change. The French president has called for a revolution to happen in Paris, and the French know a thing or two about revolutions. So just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight, nobody has. Just to wrap up, we have four kind of really key moments that, and I can get into these more in the question and answer, that are coming up in the next year, and I'm sure 350.org and many other organizations will be thinking really carefully about where they focus their efforts around these key moments to really, really get us the conversation and the action to where we need to go. So the first moment is in March of next year, when these countries will be putting these commitments on the table. So as I said, they'll probably be a little bit less ambitious as we hope, but the real focus for action from now until then should probably be at the domestic level. So talking to the national leaders, doing national level advocacy, even having local level governments putting some pressure on their national governments to really make those internal discussions feel some of the heat. The second moment is in June of next year, which is when all of the countries will come together to really see what's been put onto the table and what this potluck consists of and who's brought what. So all the commitments will be on the table by then, and there's a chance for citizens, for civil society to do some real analysis and to really dig in and say who's kind of shirking their responsibility and who really needs to step it up here. So in addition to that meeting, there will be a G7 meeting in Germany that is going to be focusing on climate change, and there will also be some live Earth concerts that are happening in key cities around the world on this road to Paris. So really trying to get some of the kind of social and popular culture implications of climate change out there, and recruiting musicians and other celebrities to the cause. The third moment is around September of next year, which is when governments again will be meeting not for climate change directly, but for what is called the post-2015 development agenda, which is the successor to the Millennium Development Goals. And so there are a number of interlinkages between these two processes. Climate change is currently a goal as it stands, and there's a number of other areas where it's addressed. And it has been said by a couple of analysts that these two processes are ticking time bombs together. And if this one ticking time bomb goes off in September, then they'll both go off together, and the whole process can kind of implode. So those two are very much mutually interdependent. So having a strong outcome from September will really feed well into Paris, which I won't talk about too much because we can get into it in the discussion, and I know my time is up. But but just to really emphasize that Paris is a huge potential moment for mobilization. Potentially, in contrast to the Climate Summit, a lot of the initiatives and the commitments coming out from the Climate Summit have been worked on for many months. And while the Climate Summit really, or the Climate March really helped raise the profile of these issues and put climate change on the political agenda, and you had President Obama talking about it at the summit, they probably didn't materially affect the commitments in too significant a way. But Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong. Whereas in Paris, you could actually think about having mobilizations. The negotiations are a little bit more malleable, they're a little bit more flexible, and if you have mobilizations in capitals around the world and global calls for action and in targeted ways, you could really put the pressure and put people's feet to the fire to have a more meaningful outcomes from those discussions. So I will leave it at that, and eager to get into more of this in the question and answer period.
Great, Brendan, thank you so much. I was in Paris last year, and all these reporters and interviews kept saying to me, don't you think that something really important can happen in Paris? I think the Parisians, the French, would really actually like to be heroes of the moment, so let's hope that they can be. And I was thinking, we were talking, I mean, the French did invent positive philosophy, so maybe there's something good there. Our next speaker is Tracy Raczek, who's a climate policy advisor at the United Nations Secretary General's Climate Change Team, and among those responsible for shaping the UN's 2014 Climate Summit. Previously, she provided technical support to UN delegations in various negotiation processes related to the environment, climate change, and gender. She's led and contributed to dozens of UN publications, including the Secretary General's High-Level Panel for Global Sustainability report. Having been the first focal point for climate change within UN Women, she is credited with spearheading that organization's integration of gender dimensions and environment-related issues. She has over 10 years of experience before joining the UN in environmental advocacy, specifically related to forestry and environmental conservation, as well as education and social justice advocacy. So welcome, Tracy.
So thanks so much, everybody, and thanks, Thomas. Of course, you've had enough. Thank you. But really great panel and great audience. Thank you all for being here. So I was going to throw a few different pieces at you, being the UN. That's my job, and hopefully tying them together. Also coming from the UN, that might be my role here. The three parts of the presentation are really the state of play, very generally where are we at right now, the role of the UN, broadly speaking, but in particular about mobilizing civil society at large, and then one small slide on the way forward. So my wonderful colleagues, who I know very well, touched on a lot of really interesting points that saved me from having to do so, which is great. Where we're at right now, this is not everything, but as our wonderful moderator noted, the science is steady. There's no more argument about that, and that's quite important to note that globally it's accepted. There's no more questions are asked. It's in the high certainty realm of the science. Only the outliers are really arguing the science anymore. International frameworks are converging in 2015. This is very important. And not only are the post-Kyoto negotiations for beyond 2020 being negotiated, but as Brennan mentioned, the Sustainable Development Agenda is being renegotiated. We also have an international framework on resilience or adaptation called the Hyogo Framework for Action. All of this is coming to the fore in the next year and a half, so it's a quite important convergence of international frameworks. Simultaneously, we have multilateral and bilateral agreements as never before on climate change, the U.S.-China Working Group, etc. This is, if you dig into that, it's quite an interesting relationship between U.S. and China as never before, where it involves technological sharing on small kids, etc., pilot projects, and innovative data measuring at the city level, etc. So like never before, there's cooperation on climate change bilaterally. And shifting economics. So we're in a new fore of realization in the market that climate change is a reality to be dealt with. So at the summit in particular, for example, there was, of all of the, I'm sorry, I should make sure that, how many people, this is a little interactive activity here, how many people know about the 2014 climate summit that happened in September? Does anybody not? Raise your hand and be completely embarrassed in this audience if you haven't heard of it. Okay.
You're not supposed to put your students on the spot.
So we'll pull them aside later, two of them, and we'll tell them about it. So it was an international conference with, I'll tell you later, 100 governments, over 800 representatives from around the world who brought forward commitments. Of all of those, about 33 commitments were brought from multi-stakeholders, and then civil society, private sector, etc. The most riveting came from the markets, came from insurance sectors, pension funds, etc., who contributed 500 billion total commitments on climate action. So that's where I think we have the most potential. So that we also, I'm sure you might be familiar with the new climate economy report, which builds one of the strongest cases for integrating risk in insurance sectors, for investment in renewables, etc. And finally, we have an aware and engaged public like never before. So even the most conservative actors are finding a reason to fight for solar panels on their roofs in conservative states in this country, for example, because it's a libertarian issue to be told that they can't, right? I mean, I'm sure you've heard these politics. So we have a reinvigorated public. That doesn't mean it's easy by any means. So quick 3 slides. This is the projection of where we're at. It's no easy haul, and I'm sure you've read, or the synopsis at least of the IPCC report to know that we are destined for at least a good 10, 20 years of increase before we can, even at our best efforts, reduce significantly to thwart the worst of the damaging implications of climate change. This comes from the new climate economy, and the reason I want to show this is their analysis of what makes a difference. And I found what's interesting that's missing here is behavior and social attitudes. Because that's really, I think, a driving factor behind all of these. And I think we need to realize that and applaud those who are addressing this, which is what social mobilization is credited for. This is also a major obstacle, which is, there's many, right? Let's just not say that we have a rosy picture here, but one is the coal-fired power plant projections globally, and especially in China and India. If you look, the blue line is what's planned, the dark blue line is what's under construction, and if we're actually going to stay within 450 parts per million, we need to basically stop right now and start carbon capture. There's a lot of great bills being passed by some countries, but we have to make sure we address this issue in the long run. Brendan went over the agenda from now to 2015 very quick, but I just wanted to, this is a timeline I thought would be useful for those of you who aren't familiar with the process of the UNFCCC negotiations. The two red circles are the major negotiations that will land us hopefully with the post-Kyoto protocol, post-Kyoto agreement in 2015. So we have Lima and COP20 and Paris COP21. When Brendan was mentioning that in first quarter 2015, the countries are coming forward with their, what are called their intended contributions, let's just call them that. There's a longer acronym, but what matters is the percentage of reductions that they plan to contribute to the Paris Agreement. What's really important is that one of the first and most important have already been placed on the table. And this was the EU earlier this, are we still in November, or still not, we're not in October anymore. In October, EU came forward with at least 40% by 2030 reduction, which is very, very important. And I'll tell you that that was not certain. That was not certain 2 days before it was decided to happen. And it took serious efforts by leaders around the world to, let's say, cajole, love, massage that to go across the finish line. But that was incredibly important that it did, because it set the bar, maybe not as high as everybody wants, but the phrase I'd like to reiterate that's in there is it's at least 40%. And as advocates, if you could focus on that, if I can give any advice from the UN, it's that that phrase could become quite critical in the next year for the they're called NRDCs, for what the governments come forward with their agreements, is that they don't come forward with just a number, but it's an at least number, so that it can be ratcheted up in the future. If they hem themselves in a box, then we have little hope. Speaking to a United States audience, I thought it might be useful to quickly go through some of the things the United Nations does, because I do think it's a beacon of hope, actually. There's a lot more out there that happens than we know about. And so, I'm grateful to work with the United Nations because I believe in what we do, and we do a lot. You're most familiar, I think, with the IPCC report that's organized by the United Nations. Of course, it's contributed by hundreds of great scientists and research centers that contribute to the science of climate change. There's also the UNFCCC negotiations, which are at the multilateral, multinational level, trying to get a framework together that sets the boundaries for emissions, as well as adaptation. But the last three are maybe less well known. And international standard settings are incredibly boring and incredibly dry, but incredibly important, and happen in a series of UN institutions: ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization; WMO, Meteorological Organization; ITU, which was the oldest UN convention. It used to be the Telegraph Union, but now it's the Telecommunications Union. And what they're doing is they're setting standards, in some cases with ICAO, it's to set emissions reductions by 2% per year in the aviation industry, which is critical. This is an industry that everyone gave up on at COP in Copenhagen. They said, you can't talk about aviation, too controversial and too difficult, so they just put it outside of the negotiations, basically. But ICAO kept at the work, and they're working with the aviation industry and the research institutions to set standards and to reduce emissions. That's only one example, and there's many. ITU, for example, is working on international standards for smart grids, because once they're up and running, we need to know what the metrics are. Capacity building programs. There's over 40 UN organizations that are working on climate change, and one of my wonderful colleagues pulled this together, which took a lot. So if you're interested, I'll show you this, and you can download it online. That shows the story of all that the UN does. But capacity building and programmatic support is very, very supportive for these developing states, especially where they have limited ministries, et cetera, with capacity that need to reduce emissions or build their capacity for adaptation and resilience. And then finally, political will and norm setting. And this is where the expectations of what can be done get set. And this is, again, where I think mobilization is incredibly important. And when you said, I don't know how much influence the march actually had on what was delivered at the summit, we knew that march was happening. And we reminded leaders that the march was happening a good months beforehand. So it does matter. And it matters that they know that everyone's watching. So there is an absolute link. The more we communicate with each other and that the leaders know that the international community is watching them, the expectations, local norms, etc., I think are improved. I just wanted to mention that the Secretary General has this on the top of his agenda for the past 5 years. It's a personal issue to him. He would be talking about Syria and Ebola, and he'll walk out of the room to the government and say, by the way, what are you doing on climate change? Make sure you're doing your absolute best. He's been involved since 2007. And the reason I'm showing a few photos is because it'd be one thing if he does these on-site visits and he just goes undoes these things. However, what's really great is how he works with civil society. And this is where Greenpeace actually brought forward a petition of 6 million signatures for action in the Arctic. And that sort of closing the link between civil society action, his concern for a specific region, etc. And this got media pickup as well because Greenpeace rather radical, UN not so radical. It made some news, which was great. The climate summit, which was just last month, I think. I'm in a time warp, I have to tell you. I don't think I slept for a year. We did have over 100 heads of state. We had 800, if you put all that math together, which this non-state actor is incorrect. We had over 800 CEOs, heads of civil society, etc., come and make pledges. And of course, the march beforehand. The proving president is right. We do have a call for the greatest alliance, and the alliance includes everybody. This is for you really to read, but if you want to go online to look at the chair's summary, there were between 30 and 40 announcements. They did not solve the climate crisis by any means. They were emblematic of the type of partnerships we need to solve the climate crisis. We had the CEO of Cargill, which produces 40% of the world's palm oil, commit to sustainable sustainable production of it. We had Dunkin' Donuts, Kellogg's, Walmart, McDonald's, these amazing companies who you think kind of forgot that they have a responsibility to the planet, come forward with civil society, with governments, etc., and commit to sustainable production in beef, in corn, and whatever their agriculture production was. So some really phenomenal shifts in the mindsets. And some of these are not joiners. McDonald's, for example, they don't join World Economic Forum, they don't join other clubs with CEOs, but they came to the summit and they stuck their neck out. So this was quite valuable to the international community and also to other CEOs to see that they were willing to take this step. I want to mention too the Compact of Mayors, which I think is one of the aspects that the others have noted is action by cities right now is one of the cutting edge areas of change and climate change. The commitment in particular was for the summit was to harmonize the metrics of how they disclose their emission targets and report them, which doesn't sound that impressive. However, to take action, you have to eventually be speaking the same language. So that was quite phenomenal. And then over 200 cities made additional concrete pledges of how they would reduce their emissions.
Tracy, can you paragraph that?
Yeah. The outreach of this summit was phenomenal. 3 billion impressions globally, the greatest, almost 3 times of what was at Rio. And I want to quickly go through, when you said there was a splash, this was the splash, and if you focus in on that area, you can see the splash of the march. This is the Twitter globally, was slightly higher than the summit. But I think what's interesting is the ripples afterwards. There's a 10 to 15% increase in coverage of climate change issues globally since the summit. So it isn't much higher, but it is higher. It made a perpetual impact. And this is a breakdown of what has been tweeted around the world. So you'll see what issues, there's just 2 slides here. It's quite interesting. Weather, of course, stays strong. And oceans stays rather strong, and water, and the Arctic, generally. Energy, of course, as well. The last couple slides are really about how people make decisions. And I think this just shows that the issue is changing, especially in the United States, that we're finding not only are Democrats caring about this issue, but more Republicans are as well. and the emotions of climate change, which I think is really important to tap into when you're working on the ground with canvassing, getting the moms from the View to watch it, etc. What turns people into carrying people into activists? And they found that those who support climate policy are on the right, and they tend to be those who are more into the hopeful, interested. We do have guilty and depressed. But once you get into the angry and disgusted, you've lost them. You've lost them. So there's a certain level of some sort of hope you have to maintain out there to get people to take action. Last slide, the way forward. What I really want to focus on here is the last bullet. We have the agendas converging in 2015, just to reiterate that. We have the multifaceted solutions. Everyone touched on this. It's no longer, top-down international agreements will solve everything. It's no longer just recycle. It's multifaceted solutions. We need everybody to be contributing. But I think the good news is we have a more mature audience than ever before and a more diverse audience. So we have people from all walks of life who care about this issue like never before. And for various reasons. And so that's why there's no one silver bullet, there's also no one silver social movement. It's unions for jobs, it's health advocates for the health issues, etc. It's even the simple living advocates at the very, very end, at its simplicity, because there's a whole back to, living simply, living small, DIY, etc. DIY, do it yourself, DIY? Yeah. DIY, no, you're not DIY. So, and security, we're getting approached with people bringing the whole climate change and security back on. So there's different reasons for getting involved. I think that's it. So hopefully good fodder for discussion.
Thank you, Tracy. That was great. I have to say, as academics, we're very familiar with things that are dry but important. Personally, as someone in history of science and technology, I get excited when people talk about telegraphs and things like that. So that was great. So I've been asked to start the discussion by posing a few questions to the panel. We've got half an hour, so maybe we'll spend 15 minutes on that, and then we'll open up to the audience at large. So I thought, and everyone raised lots of great issues, so if I focus on one or two things, it's not because the other things aren't important too. I'm just going to be completely idiosyncratic and focus on things I think are interesting, but also maybe things that are interesting to our audience. So I thought I'd start by asking Jamie to talk a little bit about divestment, because that's something that I know a lot of people here are interested in. I know we have representatives of both the Divest Harvard and Fossil-Free MIT here today. The students on our campus and at MIT have been very concerned about this issue. We've had prominent alumni, members of the corporation speak out, over 100 faculty, in fact a lot more than 100. Ben, what's the number up to now? We're over 200, yeah. So there's been a huge increased interest among the faculty just in the last few weeks, but a kind of resistance from the administration, and even among our faculty, even people who really care about this issue, who we know are totally on board about the importance of it, a lot of people are still uncertain or nervous about divestment. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about how you think about divestment in terms of its importance, both directly in terms of impacts on the private sector, but also indirectly in terms of moving the conversation or getting more people to think through what this issue is. Just, and also what do you think we ought to be saying to Drew Faust about this issue that we aren't already saying?
Maybe I'll grab this one. Yeah, well, riffing on divestment is one of my favorite pastimes, so I'm happy to. I'll try and keep it quick. As I was saying before, I think that it's an incredibly important campaign. And I'll admit, when we got involved in divestment as 350.org, we had some doubts about whether it would take off. It seemed sort of technical, it was a little dry in some ways, and this feeling of would it really catch on? And we actually launched a campaign, now's a good time to talk about it, 2 days after the election in 2012. And it was really with an eye towards this idea that with the election out of the way, we needed to realize that we weren't going to see the type of political progress we need unless we can really take on the power of the fossil fuel industry. And so I think divestment works in a number of different realms, and each of them are important. One is it's a moral argument, and I think that's first and foremost. Putting it forward that if it's wrong to wreck the planet, it's also wrong to profit from that wreckage. And putting this into moral terms and making climate change a moral issue, I think is incredibly important. If you look at previous social causes, they've really taken off and made progress. When it becomes a little bit more black and white and people are forced to choose sides, it's never comfortable. The anti-apartheid campaign went on for over a decade with very long debate at institutions like Harvard about divestment, whether it's the right move for the institution. Harvard eventually made the right call, but it took quite a long time. It's meant to be uncomfortable to debate these things and to really put our money where our mouths are a lot of the time. So it's by no means an easy conversation, but I think a really important one. And moving into that moral realm is really key. So it's been great to see faith institutions in particular take a move on it. And I'm forgetting the name of the church now, but the one right there in Harvard Square with Fred Small. First Parish. It's very good to have First Parish right across the yard saying sort of, we divested, what about you? I think moving that conversation like that is great. The second space where it's important is politically. I think, divestment is in many ways more of a political strategy than it is an economic one. There's a real sense that by going after this, by divesting and making these industries a bit more like big tobacco, you begin to weaken their political power in Washington. Just look at the election right now. You have candidates on both sides of the aisle who are proudly trumpeting their connections to the oil industry and standing alongside them. If you go back and read some of the coverage of the big tobacco fights in the 90s, you begin to see people like John McCain saying in Time magazine, I don't think Republicans should take money from big tobacco anymore because it makes us look bad. Everybody knows that they're acting outside of the public interest. That's the same thing we need to have in the big oil. We're not there yet. And actually, I think the public is far ahead on this. People don't actually like these companies when you poll them on it, but politicians still stand with them. That needs to change. And I think it's beginning to. The final space is the economic one. And this, I think, has been the most surprising for me and the most interesting. And I won't ramble on about it for that much now, but I encourage people to look into the kind of concepts that are moving. One of them is this idea around stranded assets and about a carbon bubble. And the basic idea is that if there's a limited budget of carbon we can put into the atmosphere, roughly 500 and now really 15 probably gigatons, the fossil fuel industry has over 5 times that amount just in the reserves they already have on the books. So roughly 2795. That means that these companies, their business plan is to burn enough carbon to take us to upwards of 4 to 7 degrees. It's completely antithetical to everything that Tracy and others are talking about, the agreements that we've committed to keep global warming below 2 degrees. Something's got to give. And if those companies aren't adapting and changing their business model, we're in for quite a shock in the economy when PBD Coal suddenly says, actually, we're not going to be able to pick that stuff up. So that argument, I think, is really interesting, and it's beginning to really take hold in financial sector. It's fun to be down in New York and see people, even on Wall Street. I have a friend who works at Lehman Brothers. Used to work there and now had to move over after the last crash. He's saying, oh yeah, suddenly everybody at JP Morgan, they're talking about the carbon bubble and all that. I never thought, So I think it's really beginning to happen. The second place, of course, is understanding the opportunity. That I think we're getting a better sense of the potential of not just divestment, but reinvestment to move money in a positive direction. And that's exciting for people who are sort of saying, wait, why are we giving all of this money to these fossil fuel companies on Wall Street when we could be investing in companies here in our state and in our community that create jobs locally? So that's a powerful argument. So I would say keep pushing Harvard. Someone said to me today, I was talking to some students, and they said there's a saying that, and I'll repeat their words, not mine, but Harvard doesn't like to lead, it likes to follow loudly. So I would encourage Harvard to this time maybe lead loudly. It's too late, Stanford already scooped you in some ways. But
only on coal.
Only on coal, there's more to do. So I think Harvard could be a leader in this. I think, if you're a university whose motto is veritas, and truth, to be investing in companies that spend tens of millions of dollars to obscure the truth and to look away from the truth of this issue and say that we don't have a role in that and our money's off limits, I think is a real abdication of leadership. So for an institution that should prize debate, should be engaged in these issues, should be engaging the community in it, I think Harvard could do a lot more. And so as 350, we're happy that all you guys are stirring it up and excited to work with you all to try and cause some good trouble over the months to come. So I think all eyes are certainly on this institution and more can be done.
So there you go, you just admitted you're a troublemaker. Well, I think that's really helpful, and I think you know, most of those things you've said are things I think that all of us here have already thought and often said, but I think one thing you added that's really important that maybe we haven't done is the idea that it's not just about divestment, it's also about reinvestment. And maybe we can think about focusing a little bit more attention on the idea of positive investment in the things that we want to happen as well as disinvestment from the things we don't want. I want to open it up to Tracy and Brendan to talk a little bit more about other grassroots things. We mentioned cities, and in our, I always like to sort of bring the audience in on conversations we had beforehand. So over tea beforehand, we talked about the top-down versus bottom-up problem, and someone said this isn't going to be fixed town by town, and the rest of us at the table immediately jumped on that and said, well, why not? So let me open that up. Tracy, do you want to talk a little bit about the cities, the town-by-town approach, what you know, how you see that scaling and connecting? Yeah.
Sure, thank you. I think I immediately said, yes, it is, actually, in one way. Because, very good question. So, you're probably familiar with the various networks that are out there, right? So cities are not alone in anything they do, and there are networks that can leverage anything that they do in mass. So there's UPlace, C40, UCLG, et cetera, there's these networks. So first of all, to remind yourselves that any city is not alone. Inevitably, their mayor is part of the network, so they have a leverage point that way. But I want to admit, cities are responsible for close to 75% of emissions. So right there, they have a responsibility to act. Second of all, they are more than just cities. They are building sectors, they're district grids, they're sustainable transportation, they're the hub of possible, hopefully, building envelopes, urban planning. They are the innovators, really. So there's a lot of potential in cities. They are the they are cultural movers. They're the originators of solutions in so many ways. And they're the consumers as well, many consumers. So some of the innovations that are happening right now, for example, there's, if you're not familiar with UITP, it's an international organization. The acronym has now been lost, but it's a sustainable transportation organization of 1,300 cities, basically, or organizations and cities around the world. And they brought to the summit 350 commitments for sustainable transportation. And they're hoping to have 1,000 commitments. So it's everything from metro cable cars in Belgium to bicycle programs in Africa to various things, etc. But those happen because there are municipal efforts to connect with players on the ground to commit to this. And then what's great is then they link in with each other in these international organizations, and then they make these big splashes here and there. So this isn't happening top down, and each of them get to basically create what fits for their city. So this is a sort of sector based. That's by transportation. You have the same sort of effort happening in urban planning. You have it in buildings. You have it in municipal solid waste. That's another movement that's happening. Municipal solid waste to remove the methane emissions that are happening due to the fact that there's a lack of garbage facilities in 90% of the world, basically. So there's a whole movement in cities to improve garbage disposals. Processes. The other thing I want to mention is green bonds. So this goes back to the market aspect. Is that cities are now, they're the levers in financial markets as well. And there's a movement to have green bonds be made available to basically fund mitigation projects. So I know New York City is considering it. I think there's a handful of cities in the United States who are looking into this. It's more common in Europe and it's expanding. So it's something that actually, I don't think Boston has right now, but it's something that also could be one of those movements that could start growing at the local level. And then in the developing world, there's a whole movement to get credit worthiness. So cities can take action if they have funds, basically. And many countries, many cities in the developing world don't have access to credit. So there's a whole movement to help them basically meet certain standards so that banks trust them to give them credit worthiness. So the World Bank and other people are doing this. But that's the kind of solutions that getting engaged at the local level based on wherever you're interested in, what your skill set is, can make a huge difference.
Great. Yeah, I think that's super important because it also helps people not feel disempowered, especially when we have so much gridlock in Washington, D.C., to be reminded that government and governance happens on so many levels. Brendan, I want to give you a slightly different question, but related. So the other thing we talked about before, the question I always get asked is what I call the optimism question. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? So I don't want to pose it quite that way because I feel like that's a question where it's obvious that there's only one good answer, right? No, to say, no, I'm angry, I'm hopeless, I'm depressed, I'm annoyed, frustrated, and completely pessimistic is not a socially acceptable answer. And as we saw, it's also not pragmatic because it leads you not to support policies. So I want to pose a question to you, Brendan, especially because you work for an organization, NRDC, which probably has one of the best track records of any environmental group in the United States for actually getting stuff done and for having made a difference in a lot of different areas over the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years. How long has NRDC been around?
Oh, since after the Clean Air, I think Clean Water Act 73,
Since the
72.
70s, yeah, that's what I thought. So the question I want to ask you is, what are the best grounds that you see for optimism right now? But also, what do you see as the biggest obstacles, and what, but keeping it optimistic, what areas do you see for pushing against those obstacles that you think look promising?
Great, thank you for the question, and I'll definitely touch back on the previous question as well, because they're very much interrelated. I will give the exact same answer that we had in our private conversations to the larger audience here, so I'm not trying to gloss anything over or be overly bright-eyed. I would say I have measured optimism and that we should have measured expectations, but that we shouldn't let that stop us from seeking more transformative outcomes and really trying to bend the needle on a lot of these things. So I'm optimistic I have a number of reasons to be optimistic. So the real groundswell of action from all different parts of society that has been touched on a number of different times, and it was really highlighted at the Climate Summit. I think that is one reason why I'm really optimistic. Because everyone, we were talking about this before too, everyone thinks that the climate action has to come through the national frame and it has to come through national governance and national policies. And that's true to some extent, but there's a lot of analysis that's coming out to show that the potential and actually the order of magnitude of emissions reductions are about the same at a national level as can be done under the authority of cities and also companies. Of course, you need some incentives, and it's not just going to happen all by itself, but that scope and these multiple levels that we've been talking about is really there. And to kind of touch on the last question a little bit, we are seeing that action being taken, and it's really transcending politics a lot of times too, especially in the U.S. Cities around the U.S., they are close to their people. These people are making demands for resilience, to have their cities be more livable, more walkable, more friendly in many ways that don't even necessarily have to do with climate, but really touch on a lot of climate change related issues. And so even in very conservative cities in the South or wherever you happen to be, they're making a lot of these investments, and the mayors oftentimes have the authority to make a lot of these investments and set targets that aren't couched in climate change terms, but very much are affecting climate change, and both on the adaptation and on the mitigation side. So that definitely leads me to some hope. In terms of obstacles, I would say there's a number of obstacles, and again, it depends on the level at which you're working at. There are many bottlenecks at many different levels. I would say probably one of the biggest ones is, as we've been discussing, is some of the narrative around climate change. And again, everybody kind of talks about we're going to, at least people outside this room is a bit of an anomaly and a bit more educated audience, but outside of this room, people think the only real solution is we're going to get a global treaty on climate change, and it's going to be a silver bullet solution, or we're going to get the perfect cap and trade legislation or carbon tax. And those things are critically important, and they can come, but they're probably going to come later on down the road once you have many other things that are already in place and already making those changes happening. So I think the narrative piece in terms of, and again, this goes to the top-down, bottom-up, and that's, I think, a false dichotomy. It's not top-down or bottom-up, it's both. And you need elements of both, kind of like that ball of yarn that I was showing. We're kind of all raveled up in these things together. And the other analogy that I like to use is that, so I had the house on my first slide, and so you can imagine building a house and kind of tackling climate change is like building a house. You can't start building it by putting bricks up, 20 feet up. They're just not going to stand up. And then you can get sort of metaphysical and ask the brick what it wants to do and where it wants to go, but that's not really going to work either. So you need a structure, you need a frame, you need a little bit of a plan and a blueprint, but again, it really is built sort of brick by brick, from that bottom up and that groundswell, but with some top-down elements as well. So in terms of, obstacles, I really think it depends what level you're looking at. I mean, but the narrative is one that really kind of cuts across all these different levels, and I think really focusing much more on action rather than just words. We pour so many words into climate change, and I know you're a scientist. And
I want to press you on this. I'm
yeah.
in charge of science, and I just want to press you on this, because I think, though, I mean, we all know we want to say it's all the above and lots of things matter, and we don't want to blame any one person. But if you were a magician, you know, you could make one, if you had one wish, let's say, and you could make one obstacle go away, what would it be? Just like a single sentence answer. And I'm going to ask Jamie and Tracy, who will have a little more time to think about it, and I'm going to turn over to the audience. Or we could go to the audience and come back to this question later. Maybe we'll do that. Why don't you think about that? You know, if you could magically make one obstacle disappear. So take that under consideration, and I'm going to call on this gentleman here in the front who's been waiting patiently.
Thank you very much.
And could you please, I'm supposed to announce Harvard Kennedy School rules. I love everything at Harvard. Harvard has special rules for everything. You know, this is what I call Harvard exceptionalism. You're supposed to tell us who you are, and I don't know, there was something else. You're supposed to give me your name. Oh, that's it, thank you. So please tell us your name, where you're from, and please be sure that your question is a question that ends with a question mark. Thank you, Tracy. Go for it.
Andrea's father. I'm a writer, and I live in Somerville. And I have a couple of questions. One is, these targets that were agreed upon in, was it September? This recent conference with 100 countries, the targets, are there any sanctions attached to the failure to meet the targets? And if so, how large are they? And how much of a disincentive do they constitute? I personally doubt that there are significant sanctions associated with the target. Therefore, since given the magnitude of the profits associated with the burning of fossil fuels, I think that while all of this stuff that you're doing is terribly important, that you need a leverage point, something specific to change. And what that, and I mean, I studied this, somewhat. Just read Timothy Mitchell's book, Carbon Democracy, which is very good. And I think that this involves patent abuse and suppressions.
Okay, how about if we just hold it there, and maybe we can have the panel. So what are the sanctions? What are the sticks here? We know what some of the carrots are, but what are the sticks?
So the negotiations are on their own track with the UNFCCC body, which is a body of the United Nations, and they're separate from the summit. The negotiations that have targets in them, which we'll describe them as targets, but they're basically commitments by governments that they committed to for the Kyoto Protocol. There are no sanctions, right? There's no ramifications for not meeting those. The only UN entity or body that can have a sanction associated with it is the Security Council. And so that has to be a peacekeeping or peace-building issue to have a sanction in the UN. So all other agreements in the UN, none of them can have a sanction associated with them, so we're on the same page. So climate change will never have a sanction associated with it unless it turns into a Security Council issue, which it will not. I can guarantee you that. But that's where actually the expectations and the political pressure and the social pressure really makes a difference on the accountability and the transparency of governments to meet their commitments that they made, both for Kyoto and for the new agreement that's expected to be agreed to in 2015. Now that's in the UNFCCC process. The climate summit, just a little technical here, was hosted by the Secretary General. The Secretary General in the UN has what are called good offices, it's soft power in the UN. So this summit had no official standing in the negotiations. It had two core objectives. One of them was to raise political will, and get climate change back on the agenda. The second was to catalyze action on the ground. On the first one, getting it back on the agenda, if I can say very quickly, only I think 4 leaders that will be in Paris were there in Copenhagen. Many of them completely were not paying attention to climate change 2 years ago when this planning for the summit started. Now all of them are. So I think number one objective was achieved. It's not associated with targets. There was no targets announced at the summit, by the way. but it did reach its first objective of getting it back on the agenda, and thanks to everybody here for helping to do that. And the second one was catalyzing action on the ground. No matter what happens in Paris, action would be evidenced and brought forward. And that's where all of those initiatives, $50 billion worth of divestment commitments by 150 partners were brought forward, etc. Many, many commitments were brought forward. And that was to show that regardless of what happens in the negotiations, action, and to support action, to support the negotiation, action is happening.
Great, thank you. Okay, other questions? Yes. And let's, if you could just try to keep the question focused because we don't have a lot of time, I'm afraid. Thank you.
I'm Jane Mansbridge, I'm a teacher at Kennedy School. I wanted to ask a question about incentives. What are the specific incentives besides public opinion change for city leaders, for Republicans, and for labor to get behind this movement?
Sure. So I think there are incentives in jobs. Actually, they found that renewables create more jobs than the oil sector. It's a 3-to-1 in many markets. That depends on where you are, but so there's a job incentive there. Why can't I remember what it is when you retrofit a house for efficiency, for building for efficiency? Retrofitting. Why did I say wrong? So retrofitting building envelopes is a great labor opportunity. We're dealing with, we're losing in America manufacturing, right? We're losing middle America job opportunities, and there are new opportunities to be had, but many of our local officials aren't quite thinking creatively yet. So getting them to think outside of the box on new ways to engage in these markets is important.
Actually, if I could add to that, but there are actually opportunities in manufacturing as well. I sat on a panel with a man who was involved in the construction of a wind turbine lathe company in the place where Maytag washers used to be made. I can't remember what town it was, but I think it was in Ohio. And he basically said that it turns out that it's extremely expensive to transport wind turbine blades because they're so big. So even though your labor costs are much higher than if you went to Mexico or China, you actually can make it a profit here in the United States. So that's a case where manufacturing of green technologies is profitable in ways that you might not have guessed. Okay, other questions? Yeah, in the back of the room. Please tell us who you are. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Chloe Frank. I'm with Corporate Accountability International, which is just over the river. So we've been working on the global tobacco, or on tobacco control for 20 years now. And one of our really big focuses is on the Global Tobacco Treaty, which sets these amazing precedents for other movements like the climate movement by actually kicking the tobacco industry because of its vested interests out of the policy-making room. And so, Jamie, it was great to hear you talk about applying the lessons from the tobacco movement to the climate movement. And I'm curious if the panel could respond to, we want to see this taken to the next level. We actually want to see ourselves being able to apply this precedent of keeping an industry with vested interests in the failure of the climate talks out of climate negotiations.
I'll touch on it briefly, and Chloe, I'll admit, since we were in the spirit of being transparent, that Chloe and I email about this, which is a little bit of a plan. But full disclosure, since it's about disclosure, I think it's actually a really exciting initiative that we're going to be thinking a lot more about. Now, legally, whether this can be done underneath the UNFCCC and the various protocols, I think is interesting, but what was done in those negotiations, the Article 5.3 that really banned that lobbying, it did a couple of other interesting things where it helped, it actually applied nationally as well to get national governments to have to disclose any meetings that they had with industry lobbyists. Now, whether or not we can apply this legally into the framework of the talks in time to make a big impact in Paris, for a comms person, to be honest, is a little bit beside the point. It's important to see it move forward, but I think as a narrative, it's actually really key. It's been a real shift, I think, in the last couple of years of highlighting the role of the fossil fuel industry again. And actually, Professor Oreskes could talk more about this because a lot of it was based on her work. We've begun to really pull that into the limelight, and I think that that's important because as much as we want hope, it gets back to our what are the obstacles. I think it's actually useful for movements to really point a bit more of a finger. And this is when we were having the debate about, it's all about towns taking action locally. I was sort of the naysayer, which was surprising because all these people were saying, oh, but you're the advocate, you should be all about local action. And I am. I think that it is really important, but I fear that sometimes when we talk about what each of us can do as individuals and what towns can do, we forget that in many ways this is not just an issue where everybody's to blame equally, but there are huge, vested, powerful political interests that are standing in the way of action, and unless we can point a little bit more of a finger and pull those people into the limelight and figure out ways to limit their power, we're not going to see progress. And that, I think, is another area of potential collaboration, where a lot of those companies are the exact same ones. They're busting unions in Wisconsin, advocating against campaign finance reform, and more. So as much as we are all about common solutions and local action, another good thing to bring people together is often a common enemy as well, and we're happy to point them out and name them by name as much as we can.
Yeah, well, since Jamie invited me, I'll say something about this. I think, for me, this is a very tricky issue because I think most of us want to be nice, and nobody likes to be not nice, and especially American culture has a very uncomfortable relationship to not niceness. But I think that one of the things we have to really realize about the fossil fuel industry is that they're not nice. And, a lot of people here on this campus have said in relation to divestment, well, they're just making a product that we all want. And I think that's a completely wrong argument, completely fallacious, because they have participated in the same way that the tobacco industry did with organized, systematic, and deliberate campaigns to confuse the issue, to confuse the science, to claim that the science was not steady or settled. And I know from the work I've done and work of other colleagues, there are a lot of people on this campus who have worked on this. Alan Brandt on the history of tobacco, Robert Proctor, who's at Stanford now but got his degree here, me who got my degree at Stanford but I'm here now. We've worked on these campaigns. We know a lot about how this has worked over a long, long time. The tobacco industry has been spreading disinformation about science for half a century. Half a century. That's longer than a lot of you young people were alive, right? That's a scary thought, because we now know that the fossil fuel industry has been doing the same thing for about 20 years. So imagine that they do it for another 30 years. Well, you all saw Tracy and Brendan's charts. We don't have another 30 years, right? So we have to do something to change the situation in relationship to the private sector and the fossil fuel industry. I feel really strongly about that, which is why I support the divestment campaign. So let me do this, because we're almost out of time. So I've already made it clear what I think the biggest obstacle is. So let me throw it back, and I'm really sorry that we don't have time to take all the questions, but there will clearly be more events of this type on this campus. So, but let's just throw it back to the panel again for a
I'm
few.
just going to do a quick plug for reading materials. But how many people have read the article in the New York Times about Richard Berman, the kind of fossil fuel consultant? If you haven't had a chance, it's a must read. And even better is a PDF, which is in the New York Times, of his entire transcript and presentation. It's basically a presentation on the oil industry. Read it. I mean, it's fascinating from a communications point of view, but I think if you had any doubts of the way this industry operates and what they're doing, that should probably put them to rest.
Can you give a title?
It's, if people Google kind of Berman, probably New York Times, there's a big article a couple days ago. Yeah, last Thursday.
A bunch of us tweeted it too, so if you follow
Yeah,
us on
follow
Twitter,
us
you
on
can find
Twitter.
it. Just look
But
at
it's
Berman New York Times.
amazing. Yeah, Berman New York
Lose
Times.
pretty or win ugly.
It was on yes. Yeah. Oh, that's right, right. The headline was lose, right. Lose pretty or win ugly. Right, thank you.
Yes, I'm being put on the spot first.
Go for it.
Okay, so I have to tell you my training, my thought training here. I thought sectors, energy be the number one thing. We should all, okay, can't tackle it that way. It would be omnipotent knowledge. If I could have one magic wand, it would be that, and you gave me that wand, so I'm gonna take it.
Just
And it
one,
would-
not three.
Yeah, but it would be that everybody would have incredible in-depth knowledge of where we're at, and that would almost be it. Because I think if everybody had that, they would want to take action.
You mean where we are in terms of the
Where
science?
we are as far as the science, the negotiations, their local neighborhoods, the impact of their lives on their neighbors and the planet, etc. If we just all really knew the consequences of where we're at right now.
And Brendan?
I might use my wand to wish for another wand, but I know that's cheating, so I may have a two-pronged wand here. I think the first overarching one is really something that's been highlighted through the march and through, I think, all of our conversations, but is realizing that climate change is it's just a symptom of much broader causes and problems, and uniting all of those, social justice, economic justice, all these different causes and all these different walks of life that really see that something is wrong with how we are currently structuring our societies and running our businesses. I think that would be the number one thing, is if we can bring those all together and recognize that all of our issues interact and affect all the other ones, and if we support each other's issues, we will be much, much more effective in that change that we're all seeking. So that would be kind of number one, overarching first prong. And then I think the second one is actually very much to Tracy's point, to be able to communicate really where we are. I think a lot of people are still kind of stuck in 1990s or even the 2000s around where we are in climate change, but to really be able to communicate what is going on, aggregate all these different things that are happening up there, have people be connected to something that is greater than themselves and realize this is happening in countries all over the world, have that inspirational power to empower people to take more action and to really, feel good and feel like they're a participant in their communities and in their lives and in their nations and building a stronger future. I would say those two together would be my magic wand.
Thanks. Jamie, anything else?
Well, since it's election night, I'm tempted to say like I'd wave and Mitch McConnell would just disappear. So if people want to go to the bar and watch the results later, we can do that. No, but I'd say, to get a little bit more poetic, maybe. I think that I'll go with Brendan's note. I think that if I can make something disappear, it'd be our own fear of action. The march should give you incredible hope. That is the scale of movement that we need to tackle this crisis. The intensity of what's going on, the scale of what's going on, the collaboration that people are doing right now is absolutely incredible. I think we're getting close. And so if you've been sort of sitting on the sidelines and feeling like, okay, like I'll get involved when I really need to, or when it's really going to make a difference, this is the time when it's really going to make a difference. The next year or two are going to be absolutely an amazing ride for all of us. And I think it's an incredible privilege to be a part of this movement. So I would say making that obstacle, whatever it is for yourself, or kind of keeping you from getting involved, would be the thing that I would wave away.
That's a nice note to end on. So thank you so much to the Kennedy School. Thank you. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to Tomas for organizing this event. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for coming.